Hi there, YouTube. This is Mike here, working on the modular refrigerator. So if anyone hasn't seen any of my videos before, this is a modular refrigeration unit. It runs R290 propane. It's really barbecue grade propane, so it's not R290 specifically. It's just right out of the old bottle there. So did a little work here in the last day or two. Really brief work under the gun. Went to see Star Trek yesterday, and I had to hurry up and do some modifications on the system here. I'm still having to deal with overheating. So I built a new accumulator there. This is the old one here. Not too happy with my work there. I mean, it worked. The idea there is there's a little U-tube there that goes up into the top there. It is a suction, so it allows a little bit of liquid to spill over into that thing. Let me turn the music down there a little bit. So, more specifically, what I want to get into here is to describe some of my observations with the new evaporator. I'll try to include some pictures with these, the new evaporator there. So, just a brief overview here of the system. We got a little about 8 horsepower compressor that came out of an ice machine, a little air-cooled condenser there with a brushless DC fan on the back. We're going through a strainer there, capillary tube, which goes down into the cooling unit, the evaporator, down in the refrigerator cabinet. Then we have a suction line coming back out, wrapped in the insulation there, goes up, does a little loop-de-loop around into the accumulator, and then loops up around, and then heads on back to the compressor. So very basic refrigeration system. I included some pressure gauges, there's a temperature controller, there's a series of thermocouples here that are actually in line. The thermocouple bead is in the refrigerant stream. I have 4 of those. Take a peek here inside the unit. Not very good lighting there, but that's a 6-inch third steam table pan with about 12 pounds of propylene glycol and water. Pretty strong mix, a little stronger than it needs to be, but does the trick. There's a little circulating fan in there that moves air around. So my observations with the new evaporator. The old evaporator, which I included in a video. If you take a look at the playlist here, the modular cooling unit, there's a little video about that evaporator and the transition to the new one. I noticed right away with the old one that it was really difficult to get low superheat on the return back to the compressor. So I'd end up getting a lot of discharge superheat coming off the compressor here. It'd be very, very warm. Of course, it would discharge that heat very quickly on the condenser, but it would very quickly overheat the compressor and go out on overload if it became excessive. So, in an effort to utilize the system as best I can, I want to try to feed the evaporator as much refrigerant as I can to the point where I can get at least saturation coming back the suction line. And then there's a small heat interchanger where the capillary tube is wrapped around the suction line. And discharges, exchanges some of that heat from the high side to the low side before it goes back to the compressor. I'm not really all that sold on the heat interchanger. I'm sure it's an effective way to increase the capacity of a system, but until I get this thing, under control, probably going to forego the heat interchanger here in the not so, in the short term. So again, back to trying to feed that thing appropriately, because the setup and the capillary tube was originally intended to operate as a freezer, and now I'm trying to operate as a refrigerator. That cap tube was a bit long, trying to get the large amount of restriction to get that low suction pressure and thus low saturation saturation temperature on the low side, because I was operating at a low air temperature. Moving into refrigeration, that made it difficult to appropriately feed the evaporator with enough refrigerant and keep that superheat level low on the suction line. So initially what I was working with most of the history of this system is about 4 feet of 031 inside diameter capillary tubing. Once I went to a significantly larger evaporator, it became more and more of an apparent issue of the length of that cap tube. Something really fun and really interesting that I found was that what I've ended up doing is shortening the length of this cap tube a few times, actually. And I went from 4 feet to 3 feet, then to 2 feet, and then to 18 inches. Now at 18 inches, which is what I did this evening, seems to be working a lot better. You would think that on the way there, 3 feet and 2 feet would work better than 4 feet. You'd be wrong. In actuality, 3 feet was a disaster. 4 feet worked all right. 2 feet worked better than 4 feet. 18 inches worked better than all of them. But 3 feet, as it so happens, ended up being quite the issue. So to review a little bit, with the old evaporator, I was getting a lot of superheat, really low suction temperatures because I had a limited amount of surface area on the suction side, and with the lengthy amount of capillary tubing at 4 feet, I wasn't getting a lot of mass flow through that cap tube and ultimately through the entire system, because if you have any restriction in the entire system, that's going to be, your limiting factor. So I was with that lengthy amount of cap tubing. I also get a lot of subcooling on the condenser side. You have a lot of liquid back up here, and so it would be backed up here. It wouldn't be going to the evaporator, so you have high subcooling and also high superheat. So that seemed to be the problem. That high amount of superheat going back to the compressor would also result in high amounts of discharge superheat as well. But it wasn't really an issue unless the ambient temperature inside the shop here during a very hot day became excessive, in which case the compressor could go out on overload. Because of the high temperature, you'd also get high discharge pressures, which I believe was contributing to a migration of refrigerant, where it was pushing a lot of that subcooled liquid in the condenser all the way into the low side. And then ultimately from the low side, it would migrate back to the compressor. So it would actually end up flooding back to the compressor. That caused me to install the first accumulator. That accumulator involves a tiny little hole right here where the tube goes all the way up to the very top. It's actually about a 16th inch hole. It was the smallest drill bit I had, and the idea for that hole was to return some oil to the compressor. I have some other things to add about that. I've actually eliminated that hole because I've had a lot of problems, even with this larger accumulator, where I was starting to believe I didn't design the first one well enough and it was actually overflowing. But I'm starting to believe that it's actually moving through that hole. It's too large. So, and that's mostly just during the off time. Once the thing actually overloads, it's pushing a lot of that refrigerant back, and then the compressor can't restart. But I'm not exactly sure in that. So let me get back to the capillary tube issue itself. So once I went from the old evaporator to the new evaporator, as I said, I wasn't. It made the problems even worse, where I was getting even poorer feeding issues to that evaporator, and I wasn't getting. I was getting a lot of superheat, but the mass flow wasn't large. So the amount of work that the compressor had to do, the amount of discharge superheat, wasn't so excessive that it would often overheat. Now, once I went to 3 feet and I eliminated 1 foot of this capillary tubing, the mass flow increased. So the total amount of mass flow through the system increased. I was feeding the evaporator a little bit better, but the suction pressure wasn't improving much. If I wanted to feed enough refrigerant to the system where the suction pressure would start to rise up until, say, I used to be running at about 15 to 20 pounds. I get it up to about 28 to 30 pounds with that system, with that setup with about 3 feet of cap tube. It was improving matters quite a bit, but I still wasn't able to feed enough refrigerant to the compressor, to the evaporator, to get that superheat down. So with the increased mass flow, that superheat was having a compounding effect on the compressor. It was already doing a lot more work. The discharge superheat became excessive, and once they get up over about 180 degrees discharge superheat, the compressor is at a temperature where the overload kicks out. in addition to the fact that it was already overloaded amperage wise. So it was really kind of fascinating to see that, and what I expected to see was reducing the capillary tube length further and increasing the mass flow again, but feeding the compressor or the evaporator enough refrigerant that I could get that superheat on the suction side down. I was expecting to see an improvement in the performance of the system, and that's exactly what I found. Earlier this morning, before I went off to Portland, I did that in about 20 minutes, and there's my vacuum pump down there. I will admit that I didn't do as good a vacuum on the system as I should, but it's an experimental system, so who gives a damn? And what I found was slightly improved performance, lower amounts of superheat. The system operated better and longer in the excessive heat that I get in the shop here. So, but ultimately, I eventually did find a problem there. So you see some of my data there. At about 12:30, it was getting towards the end of a run cycle where it gets the coolant down to about 16 degrees. And then if you see all those repeated cycles, well, that is the overload going out and then clicking back in and then out and then in and then out and then in. Something of note is that bottom red line and the blue line above it that's oscillating up and down. What I notice is that I'm getting some the temperature of the superheat thermocouple, which is after the heat interchanger, that typically is 20 or 30 degrees or more above the superheat thermocouple just before the heat interchanger and after the evaporator. The one right after the evaporator is usually I'm looking to get it close to saturation. It doesn't always happen. That's one of the reasons I want to try to reduce that cap tube length, is to get it down to operating temperatures a lot quicker in this cycle. But as I said, the one after the heat interchanger, a lot of heat is added from that cap tube and from just ambient temperature, absorbed through the copper here, air to copper. What I notice is that I get these deep spikes in that blue one above it, downward, very close and almost very, right to the same temperature as the suction one. That's starting to suggest to me that I'm actually getting some liquid passage through. So that's one of the reasons that I eliminated that small oil wicking hole. I believe that I can. Propane has an affinity. It's very miscible. I'm gonna say it's very miscible with refrigerant oil of various sorts. So I should be able to get plenty of oil carrying with that. And if I don't, I bust the compressor. So what? I'll learn something that way. So I eliminated that small hole, and hopefully tomorrow I'm able to solve some of those issues with the compressor shutdown. So as I said, I went to 2 feet this morning. 3 feet was, yesterday or the day before. But tonight I went ahead and I eliminated that hole in the accumulator, and I busted her down to 18 inches. Doing that required that I unwrap a lot of the heat interchanger, because that's where most of my capillary tube was stored, and I'm down at roughly 18 inches. I'm kind of guessing, but I think that's about where I'm at. And what I'm getting now is much higher suction pressures in operation at down around temperature here. So we're at 23. It'll kick on at 26. It runs at about 25 to 30 pounds on the low side, which is somewhere around like 0 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, trying to maintain the coolant temperature between 16 and 26 to keep the air temperature inside, between 34 and 38. So I'm much happier with that. My discharge superheat isn't as excessive because my suction superheat isn't so high. Ultimately, I'm probably going to almost eliminate the heat interchanger. This is going to be re-insulated here. I just did this for demonstration purposes. I'll have to cover all that up because that's going to absorb heat from the ambient environment. We don't need to be moving that heat around and discharging here at the condenser. That will help somewhat, and probably in the not so distant future I'm going to completely relocate the accumulator and put it within the evaporator assembly in the tank, in the coolant tank. It seems to be the most logical place to put it. If I do that, then my return, my suction suction temperature is almost guaranteed to be superheated to at least the coolant temperature. So it almost guarantees get any kind of slugging back to the compressor, because I'll have enough capacity in that thing to hold any liquid itself, and the heat of the coolant itself will ensure that it's beyond a saturated state and it's superheated. So I think it's a wise direction to go with the system. Try to operate a little bit more closely to isentropic compression, and get rid of a little bit of that superheat. Yeah, that's a good place to move on from there. So it's been really fascinating last couple of days to work with this this system, and the temperature logger is invaluable in that regard. I can collect half a day, a night, a work day of run cycles, and get an idea of where and how well it's running. If I was able to collect pressure data, that would be even more valuable, and amperage, ampacity over time would also be equally useful. So that's essentially where I'm at right now. I'm going to observe it tonight, and hope that tomorrow it doesn't go out on overload again. It's probably going to be pretty warm again. But beyond that, I'm just gonna keep on keeping on. So thanks for watching.